On a cold December 17, 1944, the Nazis herded the American soldiers they had captured into a field near the town of Malmedy. Defenseless, the prisoners raised their hands to show that they had no weapons. That was the moment when the bullets began to fly. In just a few seconds, the snow turned red, and the air was filled with the cries of pain of the Americans. In just an instant, 84 lives were extinguished.
You figured you would capture, maybe taken back in prison camp. That's what I thought might probably happen if I was caught. But I didn't expect that.
Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the terrible massacre of Malmedy. Join us to find out what happened to both its victims and its perpetrators. In the last months of 1944, Adolf Hitler's Germany was completely cornered. The Soviet Union had managed to reverse its initial disastrous situation and was now advancing at a good pace from the east, destroying any Nazi in its path. And in the west, after the successful landing in Normandy on June 6th of that year, the Allies were getting closer and closer to the heart of the Reich, liberating every town they found. The Germans were forced to retreat to their own territory. For the first time in World War II, the battles were being fought within German borders. By December 1944, with the best Axis armies destroyed or defeated, and with winter approaching, everyone expected the Nazi troops to take cover and go on the defensive. However, the Führer had another idea in mind. He knew that he would have no chance of winning the current two-front war that was being fought, so one of his enemies had to be eliminated, or at least stopped. So, together with his top generals, he began to plan what would be Germany's last offensive in the conflict. On December 16, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge began, when 3 Nazi armored armies, with almost 500,000 men in total, attacked the Allies from the west. The British, French, and Americans were taken by surprise, as they did not think that the Reich still had the capacity to launch such an operation. The Germans' objective was to enter through the Ardennes forest until they were behind enemy lines and capture the Belgian port of Antwerp. In this way, they would have a base through which they could bring ammunition and other supplies to the front. One of these armies was commanded by Colonel Joachim Peiper. He was an officer in the SS, the most brutal organization within the German armed forces, who had risen rapidly due to his efficiency and cruelty. He fought in France, the Soviet Union, and Italy, and in all of these countries he carried out massacres against civilians or prisoners of war. These were the qualities that Hitler was looking for to lead his great offensive.
Commanding the infamous Blowtorch Battalion, Peiper himself was proud of the brutal reputation his men had earned, once writing,
"Our reputation precedes us as a wave of terror and is one of our best weapons. Even old Genghis Khan would gladly have hired us as helpers."
With his 4,800 men, Peiper had been tasked with capturing the town of Bonnier in Belgium. It was located at an important crossroads, which gave way to many other settlements, and was on the Meuse River. Seizing this point was key to the German advance in the Ardennes. On the morning of December 16th, the Nazis began their offensive after a massive bombardment along a 130-kilometer-long front. Peiper's SS army quickly encountered American forces, who offered fierce resistance. But the Allies were exhausted after months of constant battles. This factor, coupled with the unexpectedness of the attack, caused the Americans to be overtaken the next day. The Germans had managed to reach the rear of the enemy lines, and due to attacks elsewhere along the front, Uncle Sam's forces were unable to pursue them. Piper, however, found that the road he intended to take to Bonnier was impenetrable for his tanks. This forced him to turn further north towards the Belgian town of Malmedy. Resistance in this area was light, as the place was approximately 20 kilometers away from the battlefront. Many of the men stationed there were medical personnel, who, along with their patients, began to evacuate the area when news of the Nazi advance arrived. The American commanders, when they became aware of Piper's intentions, sent some of their units to Malmedy. But these divisions were for the most part inexperienced and ill-equipped to face the fearsome German tanks. They had only jeeps and other light vehicles, and almost no artillery pieces. At noon on December 17th, the Nazi battleships made contact with the Americans and opened fire. Soon, chaos broke out.
I saw an enemy truck column negotiating the intersection, moving south. The lead panzer opened fire. Several vehicles immediately caught fire. The column became confused and the vehicles began running off the road and into each other. That was the moment to attack. Before reaching the intersection, we were hit by machine gun fire and rifle fire from the dismounted crews. When my lead panzer had approached to within 60 to 70 meters, the Americans stood up from the roadside ditch and raised their hands to surrender.
Within minutes, the skirmish was over. The Americans, outnumbered and out-equipped, had no chance. Those lucky enough to survive the attack were forced to drop their weapons and surrender. Only a handful of soldiers managed to flee into the Belgian fields, escaping the German clutches. Dragging his captives along, Piper continued on his way to the crossroads at Bonnier. There, they reunited the Americans with other prisoners they had taken that day. According to witnesses, the Americans numbered around 120 and had been taken to a farm where they were forced to stand. The Germans proceeded to search them carefully, taking away all their belongings, such as rings, wallets, watches, and photos. The Allied soldiers were uneasy about their enemy's behavior. Many of them were being treated by the unit's surviving medics, but the Germans refused to assist them. For half an hour, the Nazis held their prisoners there, while lining up their tanks just in front of them. They stood around each vehicle. The tension in the air was broken when one of the Germans drew his pistol, pointed it at the mass of men, and pulled the trigger. Immediately, a macabre bloodbath began. The SS soldiers opened fire indiscriminately on the POWs, who had no defense whatsoever. Dozens were killed in just seconds. A few tried to escape into the open, but most were hunted down and executed. When the shooting stopped, the only sound that could be heard was the agonized screams of the wounded Americans, bleeding out in the grass and snow. However, this was not the end of the slaughter. The Germans methodically closed in on the remaining men and finished them off with a shot to the head, without the slightest sign of remorse or mercy. The few Americans who had managed to escape hid in a cafe near the crossroads, but were quickly discovered by the Nazis. They barricaded the doors and set fire to the building, burning the fugitives alive. Some managed to escape through the windows, but the Germans were waiting for them. Like their comrades, they were cut down by the Nazis' guns. 84 people died in the Malmedy massacre. The only survivors were those who pretended to be hit by bullets and threw themselves to the ground, or the wounded who were able to resist their pain and make no sound. They had to remain completely still while the Germans walked among the corpses, shooting anyone who showed signs of life.
I was conscious as I lay there. I could hear the German voices and laughing. Then I heard pistol shots. And one of my companions, who was lying beside me moaning and spitting blood, was approached by a German who fired 4 shots from a pistol into his body.
Once this gruesome operation was complete, the Germans got into their vehicles and left the area to join the rest of their forces. Eventually, the survivors were able to get up and seek medical attention at the Allied positions. The American authorities quickly learned of what had happened at Malmedy, and they were quick to report the story to the press. The accounts of the massacre reached the ears of many American soldiers. Almost everyone was now aware that SS men were summarily executing prisoners of war. This caused a terrible thirst for revenge to spread. Unofficial orders were even issued that any German soldier belonging to this organization should suffer the same fate as those killed at Malmedy. This was the case, for example, with the Chenonia massacre on January 1st, 1945, where 80 German prisoners of war were gunned down by the furious Americans. Joachim Peiper and his army, meanwhile, continued to advance through Belgium. Until December 21st, after the massacre at Malmedy, new executions of both captured soldiers and civilians were reported every day, all ordered by the SS officer. There are also records of numerous rapes against Belgian women by their men, most of which ended with the murder of the victim. The number of fatalities caused by these units numbered in the hundreds, and most occurred within the span of 7 bloody days. The crimes committed against their comrades motivated the Allies, who in the following days fought fierce battles against the Nazis. All 3 German armies, including Peiper's, were stopped before they could achieve their objectives. After heavy fighting in which thousands of people died, Hitler's forces retreated back to their initial positions before the start of his offensive. On January 13, 1945, having defeated the forces near Malmedy, the Americans managed to reach the farm where the massacre had taken place. It was there that they found the 84 corpses, mutilated and frozen under layers of snow. The autopsies carried out revealed information that reveals how cruel the German act was. Only 20 of the executed soldiers had died as a result of the first round of shots. In 43 cases, the fatal wound had been a bullet to the forehead or the back of the head. These were the men who had been finished off by the Nazis after the shooting had ended. Another 10 died from blows to the head, probably with the butt of a rifle, also while they were wounded on the ground. The rest were so deteriorated by weeks in the open that the cause of their death could not be determined. The Allies had to wait until after the end of World War II to begin the search for those responsible for such a crime. It was not until May 1946, a year after the German surrender, that Joachim Peiper and 72 men from his army were located in various prisoner of war camps. They were put on trial for the Malmedy massacre and many others, both against civilians and captive soldiers. In total, their victims numbered more than 400.
Dozens of witnesses appeared for the prosecution, including 7 men who'd survived the massacre, each telling a harrowing tale of cold-blooded murder against unarmed men. On 16th of July, verdicts were finally reached, with 43 men, including Peiper, generally held as the man responsible for the massacre, being sentenced to death by hanging, and a further 23 receiving a sentence of life in prison.
Despite the sentence, no one was executed for these massacres. By then, the US rulers wanted reconciliation with the Germans. So by 1956, all the perpetrators had been released from prison. The vast majority returned to civilian life both in Germany and abroad, after what for many had been an extremely light sentence. But not all were able to escape the past. Joachim Peiper, now living in France, remained in contact with his SS colleagues. In 1974, he was recognized by a former member of the resistance who spread the news that a Nazi was living among them. The German gave many interviews in which he showed no remorse for the massacres he had carried out, and declared that he had already paid for his crimes. The local population, however, proved to be not in agreement with him. On 14th July 1976, while the French National Day celebrations were taking place, a group of communists set fire to Peiper's house. When the firemen were able to extinguish the flames, they found the charred corpse of a man holding a pistol and a rifle. For many, this marked the end of the Nazi criminal. Others, however, argue that the body was too damaged to recognize his identity, just as had happened to some of those killed in Malmedy. When some of the American veterans who had been in Belgium in December 1944 heard this story, they declared that justice had finally been done. This is how we come to the end of this video, and we want to ask you, do you think the sentences for those responsible for the Malmedy massacre were correct? Leave us your answer in the comment box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.